Ethan's fingers barely grazed the mirror when a chilling scream tore through the room. The air turned thick, suffocating, as the old wooden floor trembled beneath his feet. He spun around, heart pounding. The door had slammed shut on its own. And then he saw her. A woman draped in a tattered black veil, her sunken red eyes glowing from the shadows. Her presence was suffocating, her whisper cutting through the silence like a blade. "You have disturbed my slumber." Ethan's breath hitched. His legs trembled. He wanted to scream, but his throat felt sealed shut. This wasn't just a legend. This wasn't just a ghost story. It was real. Ethan Parker had always been a skeptic. Growing up in a world of logic, science, and reason, he dismissed every whisper of the supernatural. Ghost stories? Just tales spun by frightened minds. Curses and spirits? Superstition. But when his friends, Alex and Emily, began talking about the haunted house on the edge of town, Ethan's curiosity piqued. It was late fall when they first mentioned it. The air was crisp, and the trees had shed their leaves, leaving a barren landscape that matched the unsettling story they told. "There's an old house up north," Emily began, her eyes wide with excitement, "and it's been abandoned for years. No one dares to go near it, but there are rumors." "Rumors?" Ethan asked, smirking. "You mean urban legends, right? Like the ones about Bigfoot?" Emily nodded, her tone serious. "No, this one's different. People say the woman who lived there practiced black magic. Her name was Isabel Blackwood. They say she's still there, watching." Ethan's laugh was loud. "Black magic? Really, Em? You're not serious." Alex, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. "I'm not saying I believe it, but there are people who do. They say she was a witch, and when she died, her spirit never left. That house has been cursed ever since." Ethan looked at his friends, amused. "So what? You want me to go ghost hunting with you? You know how I feel about this nonsense." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Are you scared?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Scared? Please. I'll go, but only if we take a camera and get some footage for laughs. Who knows, maybe I'll catch a ghost on tape." That night, Ethan made a decision. He wasn't just going to visit the house to debunk some ridiculous stories. He was going to prove once and for all that there was nothing to fear. The next weekend, the three of them piled into Ethan's truck. The journey to the house was long and silent, the road winding through dense woods, as if the forest itself was trying to conceal the abandoned mansion. The house had been standing there for over a century, its structure decaying, windows boarded up, and its once beautiful garden now a wasteland of overgrown vines and weeds. They arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the surroundings. The house loomed in front of them, towering over the small clearing like a dark sentinel. The windows seemed to watch them, and the air felt thick with an unsettling stillness. "This is it," Alex said, his voice low. "This is where Isabel Blackwood is supposed to have lived. The rumors say she used to perform rituals here, dark ones." "Rituals, huh?" Ethan chuckled, grabbing his camera. "Let's see if we can find any evidence of these so-called rituals." Emily hesitated. "I don't know, Ethan. This place, it feels wrong. I think we should be careful." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, Em. It's just an old house. Let's go inside." The door creaked as Ethan pushed it open, the sound echoing through the dark halls. Inside, the air was damp and cold, filled with the scent of rot and decay. Dust motes danced in the faint light of the flashlight, and cobwebs clung to every corner. They moved further into the house, their footsteps muffled by the thick layers of dust that covered the floor. The walls were adorned with old, faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, and the furniture was covered in white sheets that fluttered eerily in the breeze coming from cracked windows. "This place is creepy," Emily whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Relax," Ethan said, his voice echoing. "There's nothing here. Just a bunch of old junk." They made their way deeper into the house, the air growing colder with each step. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They reached the staircase, and Ethan, unable to resist, led the way up to the second floor. The stairs creaked beneath their weight, and the landing at the top was even darker than the rest of the house. "Over here," Alex whispered, pointing to a door at the far end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What is that? Someone else here?" Emily shook her head. "No, I don't think so. This house has been empty for years." Ethan pushed the door open, and they all stepped into the room. The first thing Ethan noticed was the mirror hanging on the far wall. It was large, ornate, with dark, swirling designs etched into the frame. The glass was cracked, but somehow the reflection that stared back at them seemed too clear. Too real. "What's with the mirror?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. "It looks out of place." "Maybe it's part of the ritual," Alex suggested. "Some sort of portal or—" Before Alex could finish, Ethan reached out and touched the glass. The air around them seemed to thicken, a heavy pressure building in the room. The mirror began to shimmer, its surface rippling as if it were water. The reflection in the mirror twisted and morphed. Something was moving within it. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the flashlight. Darkness enveloped them. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the room, low and guttural. "You have disturbed my slumber." Ethan froze, his hand still pressed against the mirror. A cold, icy chill ran down his spine, and the hair on his neck stood up. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the mirror began to glow, casting an eerie light on the walls. Something in the reflection moved again. A figure cloaked in black, with glowing red eyes, Isabel Blackwood. Ethan stumbled backward, his heart racing. What the hell? The room seemed to close in on them, the walls pulsating with an unnatural energy. The mirror no longer reflected their image. It showed something else entirely. And then the door slammed shut. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the walls of the room pressing in on him as he struggled to breathe. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, and the silence was suffocating. He turned to look at his friends, but the expression on their faces mirrored his own horror. They were all frozen in place, eyes wide, mouths agape. Emily was the first to speak. Her voice trembled as she whispered, What is that? What's happening?" Ethan's fingers trembled as he reached for his flashlight, but it flickered and died in his hand, the dim glow disappearing into the darkness. The room was now completely black except for the faint glow emanating from the mirror on the far wall. The eerie, pulsating light seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away from it. It's her," Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. He was pointing at the mirror, his face pale. "It's Isabel Blackwood, the witch." Ethan turned back to the mirror, his breath catching in his throat. The figure that had appeared was no longer just a shadowy silhouette. It had form. It was a woman, draped in a long black cloak, her face hidden behind a veil. Her red eyes burned through the glass, glowing with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. He stepped forward cautiously, unable to stop himself. "Isabel Blackwood," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "The witch. This is insane. This isn't real." But deep down, part of him knew this was no mere hallucination. Something was wrong. Something very, very wrong. Suddenly, the mirror's surface rippled again, as though the glass itself were alive. The figure in the reflection raised her hands slowly, her fingers curling into a fist. Then, as if beckoning them, the woman tilted her head and whispered in a voice that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "You dare disturb me? You will pay for your ignorance." Ethan stumbled backward, his heart racing. The room seemed to spin as the temperature dropped even further. The shadows around them seemed to lengthen, stretching toward the mirror, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. "We need to get out of here," Emily cried, her voice panicked. "Now!" But as she turned toward the door, it slammed shut with an ear-splitting crash, and the lock clicked into place. They were trapped. "No!" Alex's voice cracked with fear. No, this can't be happening. We're stuck. We're really stuck here." Ethan's mind raced. They couldn't just stand there. They had to do something. But his body was frozen in place, his legs shaking uncontrollably. The mirror's glow was pulling him in, making it harder to look away. Then the air shifted. A low hum filled the room, growing louder with each passing second. It was as if the house itself was alive, as though the walls were breathing, the floors creaking under some invisible weight. And then the voice came again, louder this time, more forceful. "You should not have come. You should not have disturbed me." The mirror flickered, and a shadow moved within it. Something large. Something malevolent. Who are you?" Ethan managed to choke out, his voice barely audible over the growing hum. "What do you want from us?" The woman's lips parted, revealing a sinister smile that made his stomach twist with nausea. "I was Isabel Blackwood. But that name means nothing now. Now, I am a spirit of vengeance. And you, Ethan Parker, have awakened me." Ethan's mind reeled. How did she know his name? He hadn't said it aloud. "You shouldn't have come," she repeated, her voice now dripping with malice. "But now that you have, you will pay the price." A sudden, deafening crash sounded from behind him, and Ethan whirled around, expecting to see something horrific. But there was nothing there. Just the darkness, thick and impenetrable. The mirror began to crack, the fractures spreading like veins across the surface. The room seemed to lurch, and the walls groaned, as if they were being pulled inward. Ethan's chest tightened, and he gasped for air, his vision blurring as the pressure around him grew unbearable. "We need to get out of here." Emily screamed, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't stay. We can't." But before she could finish, the glass of the mirror shattered with a sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. The fragments flew across the room, piercing the air like shards of ice. And through the broken mirror, the figure of Isabel Blackwood stepped forward, emerging from the glass like a wraith. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the ghostly woman floated toward them, her eyes burning with rage. Her cloak billowed around her like a storm, and the temperature in the room dropped even further, causing Ethan's breath to come out in visible puffs. "No," Ethan gasped, stumbling backward. "This can't be real." But it was real, and it was coming for them. Ethan's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but there was none. The walls were closing in, the room shrinking with each passing moment. The door was still locked, and there was no way out. Isabel Blackwood's red eyes fixed on him, her lips curling into a sinister smile. "You will never leave this house, Ethan. Not alive." A cold wind howled through the room, and the lights flickered. The temperature dropped even lower, and Ethan's teeth began to chatter. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the icy fingers of death reaching out for him. The woman raised her hand, and the ground beneath them shook. Bookshelves toppled over, and the furniture crashed to the floor with deafening noise. "Please," Emily begged, her voice desperate. "Please let us go. We didn't mean any harm." But Isabel Blackwood's eyes never wavered. "You did not mean harm, but you will cause it. And you will suffer for your curiosity." The air around them crackled with energy, and the entire room seemed to vibrate with an unearthly force. Ethan could feel the darkness closing in on them. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling seemed to be alive, closing in, trapping them in a nightmare. He turned to his friends, his mind racing. They had to do something. They couldn't just stand there and let Isabel drag them into her world of darkness. But what? How? And then he remembered the camera. His eyes shot to the camera bag lying on the floor, and without thinking, he bolted toward it. Grabbing the camera, he turned it on, the small red light blinking as he began to film. "What are you doing?" Alex screamed. "Ethan, stop!" But Ethan ignored him. He had to document this. He had to find a way to escape. And then, just as the mirror had once cracked, the truth would be revealed. Isabel Blackwood's face twisted in fury, and her form began to grow larger, her ghostly figure towering over them. The walls of the room shook violently. "No!" Isabel hissed, her voice now a screech. "You will not leave. Not ever." And then the room plunged into darkness. The world fell into an oppressive silence. For a moment, Ethan thought the terror might be over, that perhaps Isabel Blackwood's spirit had been banished back to the void. But as the darkness swallowed the room, an icy chill spread through his body, leaving his skin numb. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a physical force. Then he heard it, the whisper. It came from every direction, curling around him like a serpentine thread, reaching into his mind. "You think you can escape me?" The voice was soft at first, barely a murmur, but it quickly grew louder, more forceful, until it filled his ears. The sound of Isabel's voice, sharp, vengeful, and filled with centuries of anger, reverberated through the walls of the house. His heart began to race again, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. "Ethan!" The voice called his name, like a command, like a thread that had woven its way into his very soul. "You are mine now." Suddenly, the darkness lifted, but only slightly. The faintest flicker of light returned, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. But in the pale glow, Ethan could see her. Isabel Blackwood stood at the center of the room, her form now more solid, her presence suffocating. Her long black cloak billowed around her, the tattered edges moving as if they were alive. Her hair, black as night, flowed down her back in a cascade of dark waves, and her eyes, those burning red eyes, were locked onto Ethan. His breath caught in his throat, his body trembling with fear. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to break free from this nightmare. But his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by an unseen force. She floated toward him, her feet never touching the ground, and as she did, The room seemed to bend and warp around her. The walls twisted, and the very air seemed to pulsate with a dark energy. "You disturbed me," Isabel whispered, her voice filled with a terrible sweetness that sent a shiver down his spine. "And now you will pay the price." Her fingers raised slowly, and Ethan's body jerked forward as if pulled by invisible strings. He gasped in shock, his mouth opening to scream, but no sound came out. His chest felt tight, like he was suffocating. "Stop!" Emily shouted, her voice hoarse with fear. "Let him go." But Isabel only smiled, her red eyes glowing brighter. "There is no stopping this. The curse has already been cast." The temperature in the room plummeted, and Ethan's teeth chattered as the freezing cold seeped into his bones. The others were just as frozen as he was, trapped in the grip of the witch's power. Ethan tried to focus, to find something, anything, that could break Isabel's hold on him. But all he could think about was how he had walked into this trap so carelessly. The legend of Isabel Blackwood had been a mere story, something whispered around campfires, something meant to scare children. But now, standing before her, he realized the truth. Isabel Blackwood wasn't a myth. She was real, and she was powerful. Her voice broke through his thoughts once more. "You think you can defeat me? You think your little rituals and tricks can save you? You are nothing compared to me. You are nothing but prey." Suddenly, the air shifted again, and a sharp pain shot through Ethan's chest. He gasped in agony, his breath shallow, his vision blurring. It was as though something was trying to rip his heart from his body, pulling at it with an invisible force. "Ethan!" Emily screamed, but her voice seemed distant, muffled by the overwhelming pressure around him. Isabel's laughter echoed in the room, cold and cruel. "There is no escape from me. You belong to me now, and you will feel my wrath." With each word she spoke, the pain in Ethan's chest grew worse. He could feel the life draining from him, the darkness closing in around him. The fear that had been gripping his heart turned to pure terror. He didn't know how much longer he could endure. "Stop!" Alex cried, his voice breaking. "You said you would spare us. You said—" "I lied," Isabel interrupted, her voice dripping with malice. "I don't make promises. I make curses." Ethan felt his knees weaken, and he dropped to the floor, the pain overwhelming him. His vision was fading, the room spinning around him, as though he were trapped in a vortex of darkness. His body felt like it was being torn apart, and he could barely summon the strength to keep his eyes open. But then, just as the darkness threatened to consume him completely, a sudden jolt ran through him, a violent force that snapped him back to consciousness. Ethan's eyes shot open. His breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to sit up. The pain in his chest was gone, but the lingering cold remained, gnawing at his skin. He looked around, desperate for some kind of explanation. His friends were standing nearby, just as paralyzed as he had been, their eyes wide with terror. But no one spoke. No one moved. It was then that Ethan realized. The curse was not just on him. It was on all of them. Isabel Blackwood was not just an ancient spirit. She was a force of pure malevolence, a witch who had cursed the land for generations, a spirit who could never be free. And now, by awakening her, Ethan and his friends were trapped in her curse. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came next. The room began to shift again, the walls groaning as if they were alive. The air turned foul, and a low rumble echoed beneath the floor. Ethan looked around in confusion, but the walls suddenly seemed to dissolve into black mist, pulling away into nothingness. In the distance, a flickering light appeared, a soft glow in the blackness. And in that light, Ethan could see shapes, shadows moving, closing in on him. His pulse quickened as he realized that something was approaching, something far darker than Isabel Blackwood. Something worse. And then he heard the whispers again, more frantic now, more urgent. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have disturbed her." Ethan looked around wildly, but the room was completely gone now. He was no longer in the house. Instead, he was standing in an endless void, surrounded by darkness, with no way out. The light ahead grew brighter, and the shapes in the distance grew clearer. It was then that he saw them, figures pale and twisted, their faces distorted by agony and fear. The ghosts of those who had fallen victim to Isabel Blackwood. And they were all staring at him. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the figures in the distance slowly approached him. They seemed to materialize from the darkness itself, their pale, spectral forms flickering in and out of focus. Their faces were twisted, contorted with a mixture of pain and terror, their eyes hollow and empty. Their presence radiated an overwhelming sense of despair. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his legs shaking as he backed away from the approaching spirits. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The closest figure, an emaciated woman with hollowed cheeks and long, disheveled hair, raised her hand, pointing directly at him. The sight of her finger, long and skeletal, filled him with a sense of dread he had never known before. "You shouldn't have come," she rasped in a voice that sounded like it was made of shattered glass. "You've awakened her, and now you'll join us." Ethan recoiled, but the spirits continued to advance, their cold, lifeless eyes never leaving him. Each step they took sent a wave of nausea through his body, as though their mere presence was infecting the very air around him. "Isabel, Ethan stammered, trying to understand what was happening. "She's dead. She can't hurt us anymore." The woman's laugh was like the creaking of ancient wood, the sound sharp and cruel. "You think she's dead? Isabel Blackwood never dies. She feeds on the souls of those who dare to enter her domain. She is eternal." Ethan's mind raced, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been so sure, so confident that the curse could be broken, that Isabel's power could be stopped. But now, standing in this dark void with the ghosts of her victims surrounding him, he realized how foolish he had been. "Ethan!" Emily's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see her standing nearby, her face pale with fear. "We need to get out of here. This place isn't real. It can't be." Ethan looked around, his pulse quickening. He wanted to believe her, wanted to think that they could escape this nightmare. But the more he looked at the spirits, the more he felt a gnawing certainty that there was no escape. They were trapped, cursed by Isabel Blackwood, bound to her eternal torment. "Run!" Alex shouted, his voice filled with panic. "Don't just stand there. We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The ground beneath them shifted, cracking open like the maw of some enormous beast. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from below, sending tremors through the void. The spirits froze in place, their faces contorted in horror, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then from the abyss a figure emerged, a massive, towering shape, its body wreathed in shadow. It was humanoid in form but twisted, its limbs too long, its skin a pale, mottled gray. Its face was obscured, but Ethan could feel its eyes that burned with malice, eyes that saw right through him. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and a cold sweat drenched Ethan's back. The creature loomed over them, its presence more oppressive than anything he had ever felt. It exuded a sense of malevolence so powerful that it threatened to consume him whole. "Isabel's guardian," whispered the woman who had spoken earlier. "Her eternal protector. You cannot escape him. You cannot escape her." The creature's hand moved, sweeping the air in front of it, and suddenly, Ethan felt his body jerked forward, as though it were being pulled by invisible strings. He struggled to resist, but the force was too strong. "You will be judged," the creature said in a voice that echoed in Ethan's mind. "You have disturbed the balance. You will pay the price." Ethan's heart raced, panic flooding his veins. The room, if it could even be called that, was closing in on him, the darkness becoming all-encompassing. The spirits were circling around him now, their faces twisted in silent screams, their eyes pleading with him, as if they were trying to warn him of something far worse than he could imagine. "Please," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Please let us go. We didn't mean to disturb anything. We just wanted to get out of here." But the creature only laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that made Ethan's blood run cold. "You think your pleas matter? You think she cares about your regrets?" the creature taunted. "You are nothing. Isabel Blackwood will never let you go. You belong to her now." Ethan's mind reeled. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, the suffocating darkness closing in around him. Isabel Blackwood's wrath had no mercy, no end. The evil she had unleashed was far beyond anything he had ever encountered. His eyes flicked to his friends, their faces pale with fear, their bodies frozen in place by the invisible grip of the guardian. They were all trapped, just like him. There was no escape, no way out. But then, in the midst of the suffocating fear, something inside Ethan stirred, a small flicker of hope. He remembered the book, the old, tattered pages that had once detailed Isabel Blackwood's rituals. There had to be something in it, some way to fight back, some way to break the curse. He couldn't give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. Ethan's gaze snapped back to the spirits, the guardian, and then finally to Isabel's distant presence in the darkness. She was watching them, her red eyes gleaming in the void. A feeling of dread washed over him, but he forced it down. He couldn't let fear control him. "This isn't over," Ethan whispered to himself, his voice full of resolve. I will find a way to stop you. The guardian's eyes flickered, narrowing in on him as if it had heard his words. The creature raised its hand, and for a moment, Ethan thought it might strike. But instead, the ground beneath them began to tremble violently. The darkness shifted, swirling like a storm. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Something was happening. Something was changing. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the world around him began to collapse into nothingness, the void giving way to an overwhelming, blinding light. Ethan's vision blurred as the overwhelming light engulfed him, his body weightless, as if he were floating. The oppressive darkness that had surrounded him moments ago was replaced by an eerie calm, a strange stillness that settled over him like a thick fog. He could no longer hear the tortured whispers of the spirits or feel the presence of the guardian. The terror that had gripped him moments ago seemed to dissipate, replaced by an unsettling silence. But even as he floated in this void, Ethan knew better than to feel safe. This wasn't over. The curse wasn't done with him yet. Slowly, the light dimmed, and the surroundings began to come into focus. He could hear the faint rustle of wind, the distant hum of machinery, and then footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that echoed through the void. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, and there, emerging from the mist, was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something different about her. She seemed detached, as though she wasn't entirely herself. As though the same darkness that had consumed the world around them had begun to seep into her very soul. "Emily?" Ethan called out, his voice hoarse. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at him, her eyes unblinking, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Ethan thought she might walk past him, as if he weren't there at all. But then, with a sudden jolt, she stopped. Her lips parted, and she spoke in a voice that sounded unfamiliar, cold and emotionless. "They're coming for us." Ethan's blood ran cold. The words hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. He stepped closer to her, his pulse quickening. "Who? Who's coming for us, Emily?" But Emily didn't answer. Instead, her gaze shifted, her eyes locking onto something in the distance. Ethan followed her stare, but there was nothing there, just endless mist and the feeling of being watched. "Emily, talk to me," he pleaded, reaching out to touch her arm. But as his hand made contact with her skin, she flinched away, her face contorting with a strange mix of fear and something else, something darker. "They're watching," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They know we're here, and they won't stop until they have us." Before Ethan could respond, a sound broke through the silence, a low, guttural growl, like the rumbling of thunder far off in the distance. It was a noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the air, through his bones, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, towering and monstrous, its face obscured by a hood. The figure's presence was suffocating, its aura one of overwhelming malevolence. Ethan's heart raced. This wasn't just a spirit. It wasn't a mere ghost. This was something far more sinister, a being with an agenda, with power far beyond their understanding. The figure stepped forward, its cloak billowing like smoke, and then, without a word, it reached out a hand, pointing at Ethan with long, gnarled fingers. "The price of your intrusion," it said in a voice that sent chills down Ethan's spine, "is a life. Your soul will pay for what you have disturbed." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run, wanted to fight back, but his body was frozen, as though the very air around him had turned to ice. He could barely move, barely breathe. "Ethan!" Emily screamed, her voice high-pitched with terror. "We have to leave. We can't stay here." But the figure didn't move, didn't flinch at her cries. It simply stood there, watching them, its dark eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "This is not a place for the living," it intoned. "You do not belong here." Ethan could feel the weight of its words crushing down on him. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was real, and there was no escaping it. With a sudden surge of desperation, Ethan broke free from the paralysis that held him in place. He grabbed Emily's arm and yanked her away, pulling her toward the edge of the foggy void. "We need to go now," he shouted, his voice shaking. But the ground beneath them suddenly cracked open, a gaping chasm forming between them and their only possible escape. The air grew heavy with dread, the temperature plummeting as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart around them. "No, no, please," Ethan muttered, his voice cracking as panic surged through him. He could hear the growl again, louder now, closer. Something was coming. Something far worse than the figure before them. "Ethan!" Emily cried again, her voice breaking. "We're trapped. "We can't get out." But before Ethan could respond, the figure's cold, empty voice echoed in the void once again. "You cannot escape the price. No one who disturbs the Blackwood curse escapes unscathed." The ground continued to tremble beneath them as the chasm grew wider, the darkness growing deeper. Ethan's mind raced as he looked at Emily, her eyes wide with fear, her body trembling. He knew what had to be done, but part of him wanted to believe there was another way out. A way to escape the fate they had unknowingly triggered. The figure raised its hand, and in an instant, Ethan felt the pressure around him intensify. The world seemed to close in, the darkness choking him, suffocating him. The creature was closing in, and there was nowhere left to run. "Ethan." Emily's voice was barely a whisper now, her hand grasping his. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know we were." Before she could finish, a blinding light erupted from the center of the chasm, engulfing them both. Ethan screamed, his voice lost in the roar of the light, as the figure's laughter echoed in the darkness. Then all at once it stopped. The light vanished, and Ethan found himself standing on solid ground once again, his body aching, his chest heaving with frantic breaths. Emily stood beside him, her face pale and drawn. What happened?" Ethan gasped, looking around in confusion. Emily didn't answer. Instead, her eyes were focused on something just beyond him, her gaze fixed on something invisible, something only she could see. "They're here," she whispered, her voice filled with terror. Ethan turned, his blood running cold as he saw the shadows closing in, dark and swirling like a storm. The guardians of Isabel Blackwood had found them, and this time, there would be no escape. The air around them thickened, oppressive and suffocating. Ethan's heart raced in his chest, the frantic pounding making it feel like it might explode at any moment. He turned to Emily, but her face was as pale as death, her eyes wide and fixed on something he couldn't see. "We need to move," he shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. But Emily didn't budge. "They're here," she whispered again, barely audible, her voice trembling with fear. "They've come for us." The shadows behind them grew darker, swirling like an endless vortex, and from within them, figures began to emerge, tall, cloaked entities, their faces hidden by dark hoods. Their movements were slow but deliberate, and each one radiated an unsettling power that seemed to distort the very air around them. Ethan's blood turned cold. He had seen figures like this before in the cursed rituals and occult stories, but to see them now in person with his own eyes was a nightmare beyond anything he could have imagined. "These are the guardians of Blackwood," Emily said, her voice a strained whisper. "The keepers of the curse. We're not supposed to be here. Not anymore." Ethan's grip on Emily tightened. "We have to get out. There has to be a way. They can't just take us." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with guilt and fear. "It's too late, Ethan. We've already disturbed the curse. We've already made them aware of us. Now they'll never let us leave." The guardians slowly circled them, their presence closing in like a noose. Ethan could feel the weight of their gaze, cold and unfeeling, bearing down on him. They said nothing, no words, no threats, but their silence was worse than any scream. With every step the guardians took, the darkness around them seemed to grow, the world shifting into a twisted reflection of reality. The ground beneath their feet felt uneven, like it could crumble at any moment. The fog thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns, and the once distant growl that had haunted Ethan's mind grew louder, closer. A low, guttural voice filled the air, resonating from the depths of the shadows. "You have disturbed the balance," it said, its voice like the scraping of nails on glass. "You have awakened what should remain forgotten." Ethan's body froze. The voice wasn't coming from any of the guardians. It was coming from everywhere, from the darkness itself, as if the very land around them was speaking. "We didn't mean to," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "We didn't know. We didn't know what we were dealing with." Emily turned to face him, her face twisted in regret. "That's the thing, Ethan. Nobody ever does. Nobody ever knows the cost of playing with forces they don't understand." Before Ethan could respond, one of the guardians took a step forward, its long, gnarled fingers extending toward him. The air seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy, and the guardian's presence felt like a force of nature itself. "You will pay the price for your curiosity," the guardian intoned. "The curse cannot be undone. Not by your will, not by your apologies." Ethan's pulse quickened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He wanted to fight, to push back, but every instinct told him that the guardians were beyond his understanding, beyond his power. There was nothing he could do. Emily stepped in front of him, her eyes locked on the guardian with a mixture of defiance and fear. "Please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please, just let us go. We didn't mean for any of this to happen. We didn't know." The guardian raised its hand, silencing her with a single motion. The air grew even colder, and the shadows seemed to press in closer, as if the very world around them was being consumed by darkness. "You do not understand," the guardian said, its voice colder than before. "The curse you have unleashed cannot be controlled. It feeds on the souls of the living. Your souls now belong to Blackwood." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He tried to speak, to ask for mercy, but the words died in his throat. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the curse sinking deeper into his bones. The world around him seemed to bend and twist, as though reality itself was warping under the influence of the curse. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his chest, as though something invisible was digging into him. He gasped, his body convulsing with the force of the pressure. He looked down, but there was nothing there. No weapon, no visible threat. It was the curse. The price. Emily screamed as she fell to her knees beside him, clutching at her own chest in agony. Ethan tried to reach out to her, but his body was locked in place, as though some unseen force was holding him back. He could feel the life being drained from him, his energy slipping away with each passing second. In his fading vision, he saw the guardians standing silently, their dark eyes watching them, unmoving, like judges waiting for the final verdict. They were indifferent to their pain, to their suffering. "We will not stop," the guardian's voice echoed, reverberating in Ethan's mind. "The curse will claim what is rightfully its own. And there is no escape." Ethan wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but the words wouldn't come. His breath was shallow, his limbs growing heavy, as though the weight of the curse was pulling him under. But just before he lost consciousness, a strange sensation washed over him. A faint whisper, like a soft breeze in the distance, filled his mind. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but it was comforting in its own way. Familiar. "Fight," the whisper urged. "Don't give in. You have the power to break the curse." Ethan's eyes snapped open. He wasn't sure if it was the curse trying to deceive him, or if there was something else at play, but the whisper felt different, like a lifeline thrown to him in the darkest moment of his life. With all the strength he could muster, Ethan focused on the whisper, reaching out to it, trying to grasp onto the fleeting hope it offered. His body was weak, but his mind was still his own. "Fight," the voice whispered again, growing stronger. "You're not done yet." And for the first time since the curse had taken hold of him, Ethan felt something stir within him. A flicker of resistance. A spark of defiance. The curse hadn't won yet. Ethan's vision blurred as the pain continued to claw at his chest. He could feel the curse slowly tightening its grip, but in the deep recesses of his fading consciousness, something began to stir. A flicker. A spark. A memory, a feeling, that whispered to him from the shadows. The whisper came again, clearer this time, stronger than before. "Don't let them win." He clenched his fists, despite the agony that surged through his body. The shadows around him seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, but the voice, whatever it was now his anchor. The more he focused on it, the more the darkness seemed to recede, if only slightly. "Fight, Ethan," the voice insisted. "You have the power to resist." Ethan's chest heaved as he sucked in a shaky breath. His legs were shaking, weak, but he stood. The guardians watched from the shadows, their eyes like burning embers, waiting for him to collapse, for him to give up. But Ethan wasn't ready. Not yet. Emily's sobs reached his ears, and he turned to her. She was still kneeling, clutching her chest in pain. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy with fear, but there was something else too, something he couldn't quite place, a flicker of hope hidden beneath the terror. I can't," Emily gasped, her voice breaking. "Ethan, we can't win. We can't escape this." Ethan moved to her side, kneeling beside her. His body felt weak, but his resolve was stronger than ever. "We can," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We have to fight." A pulse of energy surged through him as he reached out and grabbed Emily's hand. The darkness around them seemed to recoil for a moment, and Ethan could feel the curse's hold faltering, just slightly. He could see it now. This wasn't just about fighting the guardians or the curse. This was about resisting the fear and despair that had already begun to take root in their hearts. They had been living in fear ever since they had set foot in Blackwood, ever since they had opened the door to this nightmare. But the voice was telling him something different. It was telling him that he wasn't powerless, that he could take control. We can't let fear dictate this, Ethan muttered, looking Emily in the eye. We have to face it together. Emily blinked, as though the words were starting to penetrate her fear, her exhaustion. She looked at Ethan, her hand trembling in his grip, and then, with a shaky breath, she nodded. For a moment, the darkness seemed to recede, and Ethan could see the air clearing. The fog lifted, revealing the true form of the Guardians, tall, faceless beings, but now, with a clearer understanding of what they represented, Ethan wasn't as afraid. Not anymore. You cannot win, the voice of the Guardian echoed, its voice chilling and deep. You are too weak. The curse is too strong. Then we'll make it weaker, Ethan said, standing tall. You don't control us. The Guardians didn't move. Their eyes remained fixed on them, cold and unblinking, but they said nothing. The air around Ethan and Emily was charged with a strange energy, like the calm before a storm. The whisper grew louder, more urgent. Use the power within you. It's there, waiting. You are not alone. Ethan closed his eyes and focused, gathering his will. He had no idea what was happening or how he was suddenly able to feel this power, but it was there, something deep inside him, something he hadn't noticed before. It was ancient, primal, and it was his. With a fierce determination, Ethan raised his free hand into the air, focusing all his energy on the Guardians. A bolt of light erupted from his hand, striking the nearest Guardian square in the chest. The creature recoiled, its form flickering like a shadow being torn apart. The others did the same, their once imposing presence faltering under the unexpected force. The curse. Ethan realized that the curse was tied to their fear. The Guardians' power came from their terror, their willingness to submit. But now that he had embraced the light, the flicker of hope, the curse began to weaken. Emily gasped as the energy seemed to ripple through the air, pulling them from the brink of despair. Ethan, what is happening? She asked, her voice trembling with awe. I don't know, Ethan admitted, his eyes locked on the Guardians. But I think it's working. He could feel the darkness unraveling, the curse retreating as the Guardians faltered. The oppressive weight that had hung over them for so long was lifting, and with each passing second, Ethan's confidence grew. But just as he thought they were winning, a loud, bone-chilling roar erupted from the shadows. One of the Guardians, its form more monstrous than the others, stepped forward. Its eyes burned with hatred, its mouth twisted in a silent snarl. You think you can defy us? It hissed. You are nothing. You are mere mortals. You cannot fight the curse forever. The Guardian lunged at them, its claws extended. But Ethan didn't back down. He raised his hand once more, and this time, he focused all of his power into one concentrated blast. A surge of energy exploded from his palm, striking the creature with a force that shattered its form like glass. The Guardian's scream was deafening, but it dissolved into nothingness, vanishing into the air. The other Guardians hesitated, their presence weakening, their power draining. Ethan looked at Emily, who was staring at him in disbelief. You did it, she whispered. You actually did it. But Ethan knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The curse was still alive, still lurking, and the Guardians would only be the beginning of the battle they would have to face. But for now, they had won a small victory. They had taken the first step toward breaking the curse and surviving this nightmare. Ethan could feel the air thick with tension. Even though the last Guardian had dissolved into nothingness, a cold, unsettling silence remained. It was like the calm before a storm, a momentary lull in a battle that was far from over. The darkness still loomed, lingering at the edges of his consciousness, a constant reminder that they were not free yet. Emily's hand was still tightly gripped in his, her palm warm but trembling. She looked at him with a mix of awe and fear, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her voice came in a hushed whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile peace they had earned. Ethan, I don't understand. What just happened? How did you do that? Ethan didn't know how to explain it. It felt like the force that had surged within him was something he couldn't comprehend, something greater than himself. But it was there, and it had been powerful enough to drive back the Guardian. He had no answers, only questions. I don't know, he muttered, shaking his head. But I felt something inside me. It was like I tapped into something deep. I couldn't control it, but it worked. Emily nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't dissipate. She wasn't just afraid of the curse anymore. She was afraid of what they had unleashed in themselves. Ethan turned to look at the remnants of the Guardians, their forms now dissipated into the air. The room, once filled with their malevolent presence, now felt eerily empty, yet the oppressive darkness remained. He let go of Emily's hand and stood up. There was no time to dwell on the mystery of what had just happened. They had to keep moving. They had to finish this. "We need to go. This isn't over," he said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. Emily hesitated but nodded. They moved cautiously through the house, the silence almost deafening as they navigated the darkened halls. Every step felt heavy, as though the curse was still breathing down their necks, watching, waiting. The flickering light of a single candle barely illuminated the path ahead. Ethan's mind was racing. What had he just done? The power he had felt, it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just a flicker of hope. It was raw energy, an overwhelming surge that had come from deep within him. And now he feared that he had unlocked something far darker than he could have ever imagined. They reached the hallway at the end of the house, where the cursed mirror stood, a gateway to whatever dark forces had lingered here. Ethan had been hoping that destroying the Guardians would give them some relief, but the mirror was the true source. And he knew that they could not escape until it was destroyed. The air grew colder as they approached the mirror. Its surface rippled, reflecting the distorted image of the two of them standing before it. But it wasn't just their reflections. The faces of the Guardians, twisted and grotesque, seemed to hover just beyond the glass, their eyes following them as they moved. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry, and stepped closer. He could feel the pull of the mirror, its dark energy swirling around him like a vortex. "Emily," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we have to break it. If we don't, it's going to keep controlling everything. The curse, it's tied to this." She nodded, stepping forward as well. But just as Ethan reached for the edge of the mirror, a voice, low and haunting, echoed from behind them. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered. It was the same voice that had echoed through the house ever since they'd arrived, but now it was stronger, closer, almost as if it was standing right behind them. Ethan spun around, but there was nothing there. The voice continued, its tone cold and cruel. "You've made a mistake. You've unleashed a power you can't control. You can't fight us." Ethan felt the dark energy surge again, this time pushing him back. His body slammed against the wall, and the world around him spun in a dizzying blur. "Ethan!" Emily screamed, rushing to his side. But as she touched him, the air around them thickened, and they were both pulled toward the mirror. Ethan fought against the force, but it was no use. The mirror was pulling them in, its surface now rippling like water, distorting their forms as it sucked them closer. He could hear the whisper growing louder, filling his mind with darkness. "Fear. Despair. You will never leave," the voice crooned. "You belong to us now. Emily, hold on," Ethan shouted, his voice strained as he reached for her. But as he did, the darkness surged, engulfing them both in its icy grip. The last thing Ethan saw before everything went black was Emily's face, her expression a mix of fear and determination. And then they were consumed. When Ethan regained consciousness, everything was silent. For a moment, he wasn't sure where he was. His body ached, his head pounding, and he felt a coldness settling deep within his bones. Slowly, he opened his eyes, but what he saw was not the room he had been in moments ago. The surroundings were dark and twisted, nothing like the house he had known. He could hear a faint whisper, but it wasn't coming from Emily. No, this was something else. Something deeper, older. He sat up, groaning in pain, and looked around. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath him felt wrong, soft, like he was sinking into it. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to reverberate from every direction. "Ethan!" He froze at the sound of his name. It wasn't Emily's voice. It was familiar, yet distant. His heart skipped a beat. Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. The words seemed to vanish into the darkness, swallowed up by the oppressive silence. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. A woman, her face obscured by the shadows, her form skeletal and gaunt, her eyes hollow and black. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "You've come," the figure whispered, her voice like a rasping breath. "You've come to claim what's yours." The realization hit Ethan like a thunderclap. This wasn't the mirror's reflection. This was something far worse. This was the curse, the very source of the darkness they had been fighting all along. And now there was no escape. Ethan stood frozen, his body trembling as he stared at the dark, gaunt figure before him. The air around him felt heavier, thick with an unnatural presence. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The woman, or what remained of her, stepped closer. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. Her hollow eyes locked onto his, and the intense cold in the room seemed to intensify, draining the warmth from his very soul. "You've broken the seal," she whispered, her voice low and chilling. "The curse, it's free now." Ethan took a step back, heart pounding in his chest. The words she spoke were like a death sentence. The curse, the very thing that had haunted the house, was now unbound. He had no idea how it worked, but he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating him with each passing moment. "What do you want?" Ethan managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "Why are you here?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She simply stood there, watching him with an expression that was impossible to read, like a creature waiting for something or someone to break. "Because you're part of it now," she finally said, her voice like ice. "You and your companion, you woke me from my slumber. And for that, there is a price to pay." Ethan's mind raced. "Emily, where is she? What have you done to her?" At the mention of Emily's name, the woman's lips curled into a dark smile. "Your precious Emily, she's a part of this as much as you are. You both belong to the curse now. There is no escaping." Ethan's pulse quickened, panic rising in his chest. He had to find her. He had to stop this madness before it was too late. "No," Ethan said, shaking his head. "We won't let this happen. We'll destroy you." The woman's laugh echoed through the darkness, cold and mocking. "Destroy me?" she repeated, the amusement evident in her tone. "You think you can destroy me? You, who have only just begun to understand what you're dealing with. You think you can fight a power older than time itself." She stepped closer, her presence so overwhelming now that Ethan could barely breathe. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, as if the very fabric of reality was warping around them. "You've been marked," the woman continued. "And once you're marked, you're bound to me. There is no running, no escaping. Not now. Not ever." Ethan's mind reeled. He could feel the darkness wrapping around him like a cold, suffocating blanket, pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. He looked around frantically, searching for any sign of Emily, but the room was empty. "No," he whispered again, feeling a rising sense of dread. "No, this can't be happening. I won't let it. I won't." Before he could finish, the shadows around him seemed to grow darker, thicker, swirling in an unholy vortex. His surroundings blurred as if the world itself was coming undone. The woman's figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, and the voices that had been whispering all around him grew louder, more frantic. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. Ethan blinked, disoriented. The world around him had shifted again. He was no longer in the twisted, nightmarish realm he had just been in. Instead, he found himself standing in a desolate graveyard, the gravestones crooked and weathered with age. The sky above was dark, but not with the usual nightfall. This darkness felt alive, like it was feeding off him. And in the distance, standing between two grave markers, was Emily. Her back was turned to him, and she appeared to be staring at something in the distance. "Emily!" Ethan shouted, rushing toward her. But the ground beneath him felt unstable, shifting with each step, as if it didn't want him to reach her. He pushed forward anyway, ignoring the sinking feeling in his chest. "Emily!" he shouted again, his voice desperate. She didn't move. His heart sank. He reached out to touch her shoulder, and as his fingers brushed against her skin, she turned toward him. Her eyes were vacant, hollow, the same emptiness he had seen in the woman, the dark figure in the house. "Emily? What's happened?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Emily's lips parted, but it wasn't her voice that came out. It was something else, something cold and malicious. "You should have left," the voice hissed. "You should have stayed away. Now you're ours." Ethan's blood ran cold. He tried to pull back, but the darkness was closing in around him, wrapping around his limbs, pulling him deeper into the graveyard. "No, no, this isn't real," he muttered, trying to break free of the grip of the curse. But the darkness was relentless, and Emily's figure seemed to shift and morph into something unrecognizable. Suddenly, the ground beneath him cracked open, revealing a chasm of endless blackness. Ethan felt himself being pulled toward it, his feet slipping as he tried to resist. "Help me," he screamed, reaching out for Emily, but she was gone, nothing but a shadow now. The darkness swallowed him whole. Ethan awoke with a start, gasping for breath. His chest heaved, and the panic from the nightmare clung to him like a thick fog. His eyes darted around the room, but this time, everything felt different. The room was dark, but not the oppressive kind of dark he had been trapped in before. It was just nightfall. He was in the old house again, safe, he thought. But as his heart began to slow, he noticed something chilling. The mirror. It was still there. And this time, when he looked into it, it was not just his reflection staring back at him. Emily stood there, behind him, her face twisted in agony, her eyes blackened with the curse. She was still lost. And now, Ethan realized the terrible truth. The curse was not just a force they could fight. It was a part of them. It was inside them, and it wouldn't let go. Not now. Not ever. End of part 10.